Time magazine called him the unsung hero behind the internet. CNN called him a father of the internet. President Bill Clinton called him one of the great minds of the information age. He has been voted history's greatest scientist of African descent. He is Philip Emeagwali. He's coming to Trinidad and Tobago to launch the 2008 Kwame Ture lecture series on Sunday, June 8th at the JFK Auditorium, UWI St. Augustine, 5 p.m. The Emancipation Support Committee invites you to come and hear this inspirational mind address the theme, Crossing New Frontiers to Conquer Today's Challenges. This lecture is one you cannot afford to miss. Admission is free, so be there on Sunday, June 8th, 5 p.m. at the JFK Auditorium, UWI St. Augustine.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm Philip Emeagwali. The history of civilization is the history of technology. Fire is man's first invention, or rather, man's first discovery. Who domesticated the first chicken? Who domesticated the first goat? Who rode the first horse? The names of ancient scientific pioneers are lost in the midst of time. Who solved the first quadratic equation? Who programmed the first ensemble of processors that led to the invention of the modern supercomputer that computes in parallel? The computer is the quintessential human invention. The supercomputer is the intellectual workhorse of mathematics and mathematicians and physicists. Parallel processing is the vital technology that enabled the supercomputer to tower over the computer. Fast computation is what defines the computer. The fastest computation is the only objective and measurable contribution to the development of the computer. Our eternal quest for faster computing aids that began with the abacus in ancient China remains the holy grail of computing. Yet, that quest had only one paradigm shift of a tectonic scale, namely parallel processing or computing many things at once, instead of computing only one thing at a time. Parallel processing is the enabling technological knowledge that makes modern computers faster, as well as makes the new supercomputer the fastest. Searching for the parallel processed solution to the toughest problem arising in calculus and physics was like searching for a black goat at night. My journey to the farthest frontier of technological knowledge and my quest for the fastest supercomputer that is a new internet was a mathematical journey from fiction to fact to forecast. The fastest supercomputer is where humanity's future takes shape. I'm Philip Emeagwali. In my family, I traveled the farthest when I left Asaba, Nigeria, for the bus station in Onitsha, Nigeria, on early Saturday morning of March 23, 1974. At 9 o'clock that morning, I boarded the red and white painted luxury bus called Midwest Line and traveled for nearly 48 hours from Onitsha to Benin City. At Benin City, I became impatient that the Midwest Line bus was too slow at merely 60 miles per hour. I was afraid that I might miss my flight to the United States. For that reason, I transferred to a four-door Mercedes-Benz car, a taxi that was also operated by the Midwest Line. That was the most dangerous car ride of my life. The taxi driver floored the pedal to speeds of nearly 120 miles per hour. The taxi driver was speeding because he wanted to get to Lagos as fast as possible to attend an afternoon soccer match. At about 2:30 in the afternoon, I was in Lagos Motor Park, from where I took a taxi to Ikeja Airport of Lagos, Nigeria. At about 5 o'clock, I boarded a Pan-American aircraft that originated from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, to New York City, Chicago, and Portland, Oregon, United States, with stopovers in Monrovia, Liberia, and Dakar, Senegal. My longest journey was not from Nigeria to the United States, but was from the conventional supercomputer at 1800 Southwest Campus Way, Corvallis, Oregon, to the massively parallel supercomputer in Los Alamos, New Mexico, United States. That journey was to the frontier of human knowledge that was at the crossroad of mathematics, physics, and computer science. I grew in scientific knowledge over the 16 years onward of March 25, 1974, that I studied mathematical physics and conducted supercomputer research, and did both across 6 institutions and across as many national laboratories in the United States. As also expected, my parallel processing theories and companion experiments on what puts the super into the supercomputer grew and evolved over my first 16 years of research in the United States. In 1974, in Oregon, United States, I read a science fiction story that was published half a century earlier and dated February 1, 1922, to be exact. The science fiction was about 64,000 human computers working together to solve the partial differential equations that must be solved as the precondition to forecasting the weather for the Earth. After reading that science fiction story back in 1974, my quest became to figure out how to turn that science fiction to non-fiction. Back in the 1980s, my parallel processing experiment was like a warfare that I carried across a new internet, that is a new global network of processors. I felt like I carried that warfare against 25,000 vector supercomputer scientists that mocked me and made fun of me, and that dismissed my massively parallel supercomputer research as a blue sky project. Back in the 1980s, my research in massively parallel supercomputing was very advanced and too complicated, and was impossible for anyone other than myself to understand. The reason was that it took me 16 years to understand how to parallel process and solve a grand challenge initial boundary value problem. For that reason, it would also take my readers 16 years to understand my original 1,057-page research report. That body of knowledge at the frontiers of mathematics, physics, and computer science was not graspable within a few days. That body of knowledge on how to parallel process across millions of processors must also detain the reader for 16 years. I was asked to name who taught me how to harness the power of a new internet, that is a new global network of 65,536 processors. By definition, the inventor was not taught the invention that he or she invented. As the inventor of practical parallel supercomputing, the community of 25,000 vector supercomputer scientists learned parallel supercomputing from me, just like I learned vector supercomputing from them. Back in the 1980s, I was teaching them practical parallel supercomputing instead of them teaching me vector supercomputing. To say that Philip Emeagwali, the inventor, was taught practical parallel supercomputing is like saying that a boy gave birth to himself and then created his own father. By the definition of invention, the inventor cannot learn what will make the next fastest computer fastest. By its definition, the world record fastest supercomputer can only be invented, not learned. Back in the 1970s, theorized parallel processing was attacked and ridiculed as a huge waste of everybody's time. The parallel supercomputer was mocked by Seymour Cray, the supercomputer designer that designed 7 intense supercomputers of the 1980s. Massively parallel supercomputing across billions upon millions of processors represents the peak of supercomputer knowledge and demands an impeccable understanding of physics, algebra, and calculus. My primary goal when parallel processing across processors that define and outline an internet is to hit targets that were invincible to other supercomputer scientists, and do so by maintaining a one problem to one processor mapping. That mapping in turn is a precondition to actualizing the world's fastest computer. In the 1970s and 80s, my grand challenge was to figure out how to massively parallel process and to prove that the new knowledge of how to solve problems in parallel will become the vital technology that will underpin future computers and supercomputers. I was only interested in making the weightiest discovery that will upgrade parallel processing from science fiction to reality. It took me 16 years, onward of June 20, 1974, in Corvallis, Oregon, United States, to discover practical parallel supercomputing. After those 16 years, the prize committee for the top prize in supercomputing invited me to San Francisco, California, for its award ceremony, and gave me the platform to present my discovery of practical parallel supercomputing and present it to the world at large, and present it to the community of 25,000 vector supercomputer scientists that ridiculed and mocked parallel supercomputing as a beautiful theory that lacked an experimental confirmation. Over the years, the finalists for the top prize in the field of supercomputing consisted of teams of up to 50 seasoned supercomputer scientists. I stood out because I was the only person that won that top prize, and won it alone for my contributions to the development of the parallel supercomputer. If supercomputer scientists were ranked like the military, the inventor of the parallel supercomputer will be elevated to the rank of Field Marshal of the British Army or to the rank of 5-star General of the US Army. Those are the highest ranks in the Army that few, if any, are appointed to. Today, parallel supercomputing has become distilled and deciphered as a new contribution to a new computer science. The year 1989 was when the supercomputer industry understood and began to harness that new knowledge of massively parallel supercomputing and incorporate it as the vital technology that underpins every supercomputer. Back in the 1980s, the parallel supercomputer was like a giant ocean wave that many supercomputer scientists were still riding, with most barely clinging onto the then radical technology and with some falling off it. Back in the 1980s, many supercomputer scientists mocked my discovery of practical parallel supercomputing and made fun of me. Today, parallel processing is the vital technology that underpins every supercomputer that is used by those supercomputer scientists that mocked me and made fun of me. The parallel supercomputer of the 1980s was the most complex computing machinery in the world. That was the reason the community of 25,000 vector supercomputer scientists avoided programming the parallel supercomputer because it was too difficult to program an ensemble of 65,536 processors. I was the sole programmer of 16 massively parallel supercomputers of the 1980s. I was the only supercomputer scientist in the world that had the confidence and possessed the command of materials that was needed to parallel process across an ensemble of 64 binary thousand tightly coupled processors that shared nothing between each other. In the 1980s, I was the only supercomputer scientist in the world that had both the scientific and technological knowledge that was needed to deliver extensive public lectures on the parallel supercomputer. My extensive videotaped lectures on supercomputing can be watched on youtube.com/Emeagwali. I was at the ground zero of supercomputing, and that is the reason Philip Emeagwali is the subject of school reports on Inventors. Parallel processing is the greatest achievement in the world of supercomputers that resulted in the groundbreaking discovery that redefined the frontiers of knowledge in mathematics, physics, and computer science. I discovered parallel processing because my starting point was from first principles or the laws of physics. That's where I invented both new partial differential equations of calculus and their companion new partial difference equations of algebra. I was also the research code physicist that parallel processed 64 binary thousand computer codes and did so across a new internet that is a new global network of tightly coupled processors that were identical to each other and that encircled a globe, and did so in the manner the internet encircled the earth. If I had followed the advice of Gene Amdahl or Seymour Cray, I would not have discovered that practical parallel processing will become the vital technology that will underpin every supercomputer of today. I invented practical parallel processing, and I did so at a time the supercomputer textbooks said that it will forever remain impossible, or at least impractical. The forthcoming fusion of massively parallel processing with artificial intelligence will give birth to a new breed of fastest and smartest supercomputers. Such supercomputers can learn and detect and connect the dots amongst the important features in large data sets of seemingly unrelated facts. Such supercomputers can process and understand the realms of data and process them to discover new knowledge that would otherwise remain elusive. Today, robots are learning to think like humans. With supercomputing, humans will learn to think like robots, not vice versa. The supercomputer is used to increase productivity. Parallel processing inexorably changed the supercomputer, and the technology is here to stay. I chose to parallel process in the 1970s and 80s, and at a time it was forbidden by Amdahl's law as described in supercomputer textbooks that were published onwards of April 1967. My experiment of the 4th of July 1989 that I conducted across my ensemble of 64 binary 1000 processors made the news headlines because it revealed never before recorded supercomputer speeds that I recorded by parallel processing across processors. I discovered that initial boundary value problems of mathematical physics that are impossible to solve on only one processor are possible to solve across millions upon millions of commodity off-the-shelf processors that were within a massively parallel supercomputer. My discovery of practical parallel processing that occurred on the 4th of July 1989 in Los Alamos, New Mexico, United States, changed the way we look at the computer and opened the door to further experiments on new computers that might be beyond the parallel supercomputer. Faster supercomputers contribute to the expansion of human knowledge. The reason I was the only full-time programmer of the most massively parallel supercomputers of the 1980s was that the technology was mocked, abandoned as a dead-end road. Seymour Cray, the leader in the computing field of vector processing, vehemently argued that it will be a huge waste of everybody's time to pursue parallel processing. Seymour Cray and Gene Amdahl each believed that he would be dead before parallel processing becomes the technology that powers all supercomputers. On the contrary, Seymour Cray and Gene Amdahl both lived to see parallel processing become the crown jewel inside every supercomputer. My parallel processed solution of the grand challenge problem of supercomputing proved that both Seymour Cray and Gene Amdahl were wrong when they asserted that parallel processing is a waste of time.
Insightful and brilliant lecture.